Ian asked me to do a brief rundown of my paper. I'm not going to quote any numbers. If you want the numbers, read the paper or go to my blog. It's just my name, .co.nz, johnwalley.co.nz. You can read the stuff there. Whenever I come to anything Ian organises, I get intimidated because I live in a very small world. I run 3 or 4 businesses. I make a bet on the future every day, and if I get it right, I'm there the next day to make the bet again. I'm even more exposed because I choose to live in New Zealand and I sell to exports. Every business I'm in is 85% plus export biased. So what New Zealand does in terms of its position with the rest of the world impacts the way I feel, impacts how successful those businesses are. And I have no control over those decisions. So for Anne's benefit, New Zealand is the UK writ small with a substantial export economy exposed to policies that inflate the exchange rate. So 30-odd years ago, we were coming off the back of high variable inflation, relatively low debt, maybe private debt a third of what it is today. And the idea of the ascendancy was markets was growing and got sold to us. So the sale was there were 2 horses. We could jump on the financialization horse and everything would be wonderful, trickle down would work, and we'd all end up in a land of plenty. Or we could do the boring stuff and jump on the horse that looked after the real economy, that actually focused on income statements, not balance sheets. For the accountants in the room, that will mean something, but one's about asset appreciation, the other's about making stuff and selling it to people and making a profit on each sale. Essentially, the English-speaking world chose the finance, insurance, and real estate horse, the fire horse, and off they went. The non-English-speaking world chose the other horse. And so we can see how good those choices were by having a look how those 2 economies generally performed. So what did we do when we jumped on the fire horse? We immediately abandoned the link between income and borrowing. Anne told a story last night about getting a mortgage in the 70s in the UK. I have a different story. It used to be go and talk to the building society and say, well, we've been married for 3 years, so we actually know where babies come from, and so we can count the wife's salary in towards getting a loan to buy a house. What was loaned was based on what we could earn. It wasn't based on the fact that I was willing to pay more than somebody else. Once we broke that link, we then infused the anesthetic of debt into the English-speaking economies. People stopped worrying about, is the economy really doing well, or do we just feel as though it's doing well? Globalization provided cheaper stuff. Why should we be surprised today that in the developed world, the lowest 30% of incomes are under massive pressure? When we shifted all the activity off to where the lowest incomes in the developed world are very attractive incomes in the developing world. So we now add the anesthetic of consumption. What it meant in the real world of the economy, however, is that we sort of lose capacity and capability. And there's a thing called economic complexity. And every English-speaking economy has bled economic complexity as measured by the stuff it exports in the past 30-odd years. Every one. Now, that means the skill and capability of the people in those economies actually can't be brought into its international trade. we're actually selling into simplicity. Wages share of output falls, but it doesn't hurt to begin with because of all that lovely anaesthetic around debt and consumption. We're moving into a place where that loss of earnings and the debt ceiling is starting to be painful. So what we're seeing around the world is low aggregate demand, and where's all that inflation? The central banks think they haven't got a job to do anymore because, you know, the inflation's there and it's coming from somewhere. So we're going to act as though it's going to come back. But really, we just don't have the income anymore, the debt headroom, to continue the consumption binge we've been on. For New Zealand, the loss of complexity is more pronounced. You know, in the 80s, we abandoned tariffs. We're right now moving into what's called, if I remember the right phrase, the public interest test around dumped imports. So if we can buy them cheaper, and that's in the public interest, we don't care about the producers. So even though the producers are competitive globally, they're not in a position to dump stuff because they don't have the scale in New Zealand to do that. But they lose their investment, they lose their position in the world because of the public interest in cheap stuff. Wrong button, there we go. Policy interaction and a native balance sheet fixation. New Zealanders love balance sheets. When I arrived here in the mid-80s, I couldn't understand this. I'm going to buy a rental and that's going to be my superannuation. My view of the world is you bought a house to live in, not as an investment. And I think that springs from the rural basis farms in New Zealand and is driven by the fact that we don't have capital gains tax. I wonder what would have happened in the 2014 election if David Cunliffe in Christchurch had said, we need a capital gains tax so we don't have $1 million average house price in Auckland, instead of trying to justify the details. The policy framework we've got, the fire horse, actually holds up the exchange rate. I'm going to give the slide here. One of my businesses, it's an internet business, and so it's got numbers for Africa. So we can say, take today's sales and blow it back in history and apply the exchange rate of the day to those sales and look at what the delta is in revenue. It's 40%. 40% delta in revenue just off exchange rate. Price stability, not for exporters. The key graph, we go back to 1999 on the old way of measuring the real sector flatlined. The non-traded sectors continue to grow. It slowed up through the GFC. It's starting to recover a little bit now, but the difference is increasing. So the real sector is carrying an ever bigger fire sector, and that's not sustainable. Private debt growth, you know, it's what Steve Keen calls a danger zone. We're sort of 178% of GDP with 6% growth, so it's 7.6% growth. It's about like France. We're not quite as bad as some, but we're in that space. So again, with those debt levels and that debt growth, it's not surprising demands for real stuff is soft. That small market position. If I'm going to compete on smart stuff, I'm going to be in a niche. The deeper into that niche I go, the smaller the New Zealand market, the more I depend on exports. The more risk I take, the deeper I go in the niche. So when I add value, I suffer because of a small home market and a policy framework that actually lifts. And that Mike Riddell, that well-known lefty economist, reckons in the last 10 years, we've been about 15% overvalued in currency. So the other way for me is work better around the world. It's a focus on the real sector. It's increasing economic complexity. That feeds on more complexity. The tougher stuff we all do, the tougher stuff we can continue to do. And it's really a focus on the income statement. Make stuff, sell it. Make money on the sale, make more stuff, sell more. Simple stuff, but it's a lot tougher if you're on the fire horse, for everybody else is on the fire horse when you're trying to do that.
Thank you very much, John.
So, sorry it was very small.